So, here's the big question. How did a conflict in a small Southeast Asian country become America's longest, most divisive, and frankly, most controversial war? It's a complicated story for sure. It's about colonialism, Cold War fears, and a truly brutal conflict that left a deep, deep scar on two nations.
All right, so to really get a handle on this, we're going to break it down. We'll start with its roots in colonial history, then track how America got pulled in, look at the key moments that changed everything, and finally unpack the painful withdrawal and the long shadow this war still casts today.
Okay, so first things first, the story of this war. It doesn't actually start with American soldiers. Nope, it begins way earlier, with the French colonial empire crumbling in Indochina. And that event, right there, planted the seeds for what would become a brutal 30-year conflict.
So everything really kicked into gear in 1954. After a shocking defeat at a place called Dien Bien Phu, the French were officially out. That led to the Geneva Accords, which basically drew a line on the map, the 17th parallel, and split Vietnam in two. Now, this was only supposed to be temporary. The plan was to hold nationwide elections in 1956 to unify the whole country. But those elections, they never happened.
So instead, what you ended up with were two completely opposite states. In the north, you had Ho Chi Minh. He was a communist and a nationalist, and his one goal was to unite Vietnam under a single communist government. And then in the south, you had Ngo Dinh Diem. He was fiercely anti-communist, backed by the West, and he wanted to keep South Vietnam as its own separate non-communist country. You can see how their goals were just completely at odds. And of course, this kind of division, it just poured fuel on the fire. An insurgency began to grow inside South Vietnam itself. This was the Viet Cong. They were a powerful guerrilla army, supported by North Vietnam, and they set out to destabilize Diem's government from the inside, kicking off a whole new and even more brutal phase of the war. Okay, but that brings up a huge question, right? How did a civil war, a conflict happening halfway around the world, grab the attention of a superpower like the United States? Well, the answer really comes down to the intense paranoia of the Cold War. You have to understand, U.S. foreign policy at the time was completely obsessed with this one idea: the domino theory. The thinking went like this. If South Vietnam falls to communism, it won't stop there. Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, the whole region would fall, one after another, just like a row of dominoes. And President Kennedy, he was all in on this. He didn't just see South Vietnam as another country. For him, it was a critical test of America's will to stand up to communism everywhere. He even called it the cornerstone of the free world in Southeast Asia. That's a pretty heavy statement. It was a line in the sand. Now, this didn't happen overnight. It was a slow burn, a creeping commitment. It started with just a few hundred military advisors in the 50s. But then Kennedy really ramps things up to help fight that growing Viet Cong insurgency. By 1962, there were about 9,000 U.S. military personnel on the ground. They weren't fighting yet, but they were there. But that advisory role, it was about to change dramatically. The whole thing was about to transform into a full-blown American war. And the trigger was this one super controversial incident that happened back in 1964. So in August of '64, a U.S. destroyer, the USS Maddox, reports it's been attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats in a place called the Gulf of Tonkin. Then, a second attack is reported a couple of days later. Thing is, the evidence for that second one, it was shaky then, and it's still highly debated and pretty inconclusive today.
But you know what? It almost didn't matter if that second attack was real or not. The White House jumped on the reports, and Congress responded by passing what became known as the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. And they passed it overwhelmingly.
And this resolution, it was basically a blank check. It handed President Lyndon B. Johnson the power to use military force however he wanted in Southeast Asia, all without needing to go back to Congress for an official declaration of war. The floodgates for massive escalation were now wide open. And with that blank check in hand, boy did things escalate fast. In just a few short years, the number of American troops in Vietnam exploded. It went from those few thousand advisors to this, over 500,000. America was now all in.
So you have this massive U.S. military force,
but they were fighting a completely different war than their enemy. The U.S. strategy was all about attrition, using its incredible firepower in search and destroy missions to inflict so many casualties that the enemy would just give up. But the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong, they were playing a different game entirely. A long game. Their goal wasn't to win big battles. It was simply to outlast America's political will to keep fighting.
So picture this. It's early 1968. The American public keeps hearing the same story from the government. We're winning, the enemy is weak, the end is in sight. And then something happens that blows that entire narrative to pieces.
So, the question on everyone's mind was simple. Are we actually winning this thing? The Tet Offensive was about to provide a shocking and really brutal answer.
The answer came during Tet, the Vietnamese New Year. In a massive, coordinated surprise attack, Communist forces struck over 100 cities and towns all across South Vietnam at the same time. Suddenly, the war wasn't in some faraway jungle anymore. It was in the streets of major cities. They even breached the walls of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. It was a complete shock.
And this is the really wild thing about Tet, the huge paradox. Militarily, it was a disaster for the communists. I mean, their losses were catastrophic. But politically, for the United States, it was an absolute catastrophe. Seeing the fighting on TV right in the cities, it just shattered that official story of progress. And you can see here, public support for the war just plummeted. The fallout was just immense. So immense that it basically ended a presidency. Just a couple of months after Tet, President Johnson gets on national television, says he's halting the bombing, and then he drops this bombshell. He's not going to run for re-election. It was a stunning admission that the war, at least as it was being fought, was unwinnable.
All right, so now we're in the final phase of the war. America is looking for a way out, an honorable exit, as President Nixon put it. And this period is all about that difficult withdrawal and the grim reality of the war's incredible costs.
Nixon's big idea was something called Vietnamization, and the plan was pretty straightforward, at least on paper. Build up, train, and equip the South Vietnamese army so they could take over the fighting themselves. This would allow American troops to slowly pull out.
So the Paris Peace Accords get signed in 1973, and the last American combat troops finally head home. But that peace with honor, well, it didn't last. It was incredibly fragile. And without the support of U.S. air power, the South Vietnamese army just couldn't hold. Just 2 years later, in April 1975, North Vietnamese tanks rolled right into Saigon. The war was over.
And in the end, after all the politics and strategies, the real legacy of the war is its human cost. And the numbers, they're just staggering, almost hard to wrap your head around. Around 2 million Vietnamese civilians dead, over 1 million North Vietnamese and Viet Cong soldiers, 250,000 South Vietnamese soldiers, and for the United States, more than 58,000 killed, each name now carved into that black granite wall in Washington, D.C.
Which brings us to this final, really tough question. When you look at all of this, the cost, the politics, the decades of fighting, a conflict that redrew the map for one nation and completely fractured another, what does it even mean to win or lose?